pieces of legislation that was passed. And so one in particular that we're going to focus on today is Brown versus Board of Education. So like I said earlier, the Civil Rights Movement happened between 1954 and 1968. So a lot of pieces of legislation were passed so that greater equality could be attained by African Americans. And so we're going to spend this next half of class talking more in depth about Brown versus Board of Education and segregation. Okay, so there are two types of segregation. Off the bat, segregation is the action or state of setting someone or something apart from other people or things, or being set apart. There are two types, like I said, the first being de jure segregation and the second being de facto. Jack, would you mind telling me what de jure is?
Racial segregation enforced by law.
Okay, thank you. So, as you can see in this picture, there is a white water fountain, there is a colored water fountain. We don't use color today, it's a dated term. But basically, they said that there were white water fountains, white pools, white bathrooms, and there was other ones for black people. And you could not go to a white water fountain or a white bathroom if you were a black person. When it came to movie theaters, there was designated spaces within the movie theater for African Americans. When it came to the bus, an African American could go and pay their fare, but then they would have to exit and enter through the rear doors. So this was just separation of the races. It was constitutional at the time. The government endorsed it. And this is very different from de facto segregation, which we'll talk about on this next slide. Sophie, would you mind reading what de facto segregation is?
It occurs when widespread individual preferences lead to separation, so segregation by happens.
Thank you. So a lot of times when you consider the racial composition of schools in America today, there will be predominantly white schools and predominantly black schools. Obviously, with the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, this ruled that integration would be the new norm. However, today, there's a lot of de facto segregation practices that exist. Oftentimes, factors such as socioeconomics and geography could separate races. So a prime example of this would be the school that I went to. I went to Mamaroneck High School. It's a small town in Larchmont, New York. It's a small town in New York. It's right next to Larchmont, New York, 45 minutes away from New York City. And so because these two towns are very small, the students of the community had the option of going to 4 elementary schools that fed into 1 middle school that fed into 1 high school. So Mamaroneck High School, home of the Tigers, is located 20 miles north of Manhattan. As I said, it's 45 minutes away from Times Square, the lights, the action. These statistics are taken from an article from the New York Times of 2012. And between grades 9 and 12, there was 1,469 students. 5% were poor, 76% were white, 17% Hispanic, and 4% Asian, as well as 3% black. So this just goes to show that this is a predominantly white school, similar to State College Area High School. And this just shows the racial makeup. Now the next slide I'm going to show you might make you laugh. This is me in kindergarten. As you can see, I'm the only black student in my class. And this was my reality. This was my reality from pre-K up until 12th grade. I was either the only one or one of few. In my graduating class, there was about 4 other black students. And so it was never truly a problem, but I did feel isolated at some points, especially in the month of February when you're talking about Black history and the teachers talking. Someone always would say, you know, had Rosa Parks not done what she did, or had MLK not made a difference, Samantha wouldn't be here today. And everybody's eyes just went to me. It was like the emoji eyes, just on me. And I felt uncomfortable, more so in the younger years. In kindergarten, someone said that black people are made out of chocolate, and I went home and cried. I thought it was so insulting. But now, I mean, chocolate's sweet, so if you want to make that comparison, no problem. So to your question.
Yeah, how big would your class be?
379 students. 5 black students, yeah. So yeah, I was a minority. When it came to playing sports, I played basketball. When I would go to predominantly white schools, I would hear things like, oh, we need to double down on defense. Oh, she must be nice. Just because I'm black. My church was predominantly black, and so when I go to church, people say, oh, you live in a white neighborhood, or you talk white. And I was just like, oh, I'm sorry that I bought into subject-verb-noun agreement. Like, I'm sorry I bought into the English language. But I understood what they were getting at. They wanted me to speak in a vernacular that sounded like, yo, what's good, how are you? Like, not even how are you, just what's good. And I often felt that I needed to defy the stereotypes. People always wanted to touch my hair. I had zigzags and swirlies and braids. I had to have style on the court. So, but people always wanted to touch it, and that irritated me. I hate when people touch my hair. You can ask questions, I'll answer, no problem. But when you're going to touch it, I'm going to do the matrix, and you're not going to get it. So that was just my experience. Overall, I think it made me a better person because I had no hesitation in speaking to white people, to speaking to Hispanic people. This was my reality. And so diversity was something that lacked in my school and something I always sought after. Oftentimes, you know, for the next school year, you look forward to having a new teacher. Honestly, all I wanted was someone that looked like me in my classroom. So that's just a prime example of de facto segregation. The fact that my community was segregated, not because of the law, but just because of the socioeconomics of the area and geography. So this next website that I'm going to show you highlights the racial composition of schools in the United States. One second. So with this website, you're able to enter any school district. So for our purposes, we're going to enter State College. And it's kind of small. So Maya, would you mind reading the composition of the school? So the percent black, percent minority, go through the different schools.
Easterly Parkway, 528, 400 students. Radio Park, 523, 415. Park Forest.
So 4%.
Yeah. 4%, 14, 495 students. Park Forest Middle School, 14, 850 students. Hauserville, 3%, 9%, 370 students. Bullsburg, 3%, 4%, 335. And our high school, 2%, 10%, and I can't remember that one.
2,625. So we're going to check out a different school district. Yeah, tell me which one you want to check out.
Moon Township. What's Ferguson?
Moon Township?
0% of students at Ferguson Township.
Where is this?
Down.
Okay. So here we have 7% black. If we go to Altoona, which is 45 minutes away from here, 7%. Yeah, we're gonna go to different areas. Phoenixville, where? Oh, okay.
It's like 30, 20%.
This one, the third, 10%. But if we do Philadelphia,
My hometown, we got 60.
we see that there is 62%
What?
black. If we go to Harrisburg, okay, 70% black.
How about Alabama? No.
Can't just say Alabama.
Well, we can enter, okay,
Or
let's see,
Montgomery or something.
Alabama.
Birmingham.
Birmingham, let's go with Birmingham. 96% black. So you can see, just by this website, you can access it, it's called ProPublica. You can go and check out different school districts in the United States and clearly see that there is a divide. Even though the Brown versus Board of Education ruling said that schools would be integrated, today, just by practice, just by geography, just by socioeconomics, you can see that there are still predominantly white schools and predominantly black schools. Like I mentioned earlier, my high school, my community was predominantly white. If I was to travel 10 minutes to my cousin's neighborhood, you would see more black students. And if I was to travel 20 minutes away in a city called Mount Vernon, the whole school is pretty much dominated by black
All those
students.
schools are 100% black.
Yeah, so you can see that there's a difference. The school I was talking about, Mount Vernon City School District, 77% black.
You're the only white person.
I mean, then you would be the minority, but it would be a reverse. So.
Actually, you know, like the minorities today are actually, if you put all minorities together, they would be the majority.
Yeah, I mean, it's increasing definitely from what it was.
I don't think we'd be.
Yeah, like usually it's back. Like if you put all the minorities together, like.
Yo, show me where you got this.
Yeah,
data.
Actually,
Alright, yeah, 'cause I can tell you.
Data.
White people make like less than 50%, like minorities make like 56% of the US population.
It's definitely increasing.
Especially in like southern states with like a lot of like Mexicans, not racist.
I mean, if they're Mexican, they're
Yeah.
Mexican.
You want to just
Okay.
look it up?
Well, I don't wanna,
All right.
Come on, Jack.
So for the next activity we're going to do, it's probably something a lot of teachers don't say you should do, but we're going to text in class. And we are going to do an activity that addresses things about the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. So at this time, I'd like you guys to whip out your cell phones.
That's easy.
already on it.
And I'd like you guys to text Samantha Reid 105 to the number 22333. So 22333 would be the recipient. And you're texting Samantha Reid 105 in the subject.
In capital?
I don't think it matters.
Wait, then you want us to send one or two?
Wait, is this like kind of a video?
It's sort of like that. 1 second. Don't enter the 1 or 2 yet. When everybody got the response, just let me know. Did you get a text message back? Yeah? All right, so this is how it's going to work. There's a question or a statement at the top of the screen. It applies to the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. I want you guys to either text 1 if you believe the statement is a myth, or text 2 if you believe it's a fact. So in this case, Brown versus Board of Education was only about school segregation. If you believe it's a myth, text 1. If you believe it's a fact, text 2.
Oh, this is cool. I don't change these schools.
Can't change your.
What if you text this text?
What if
You
you
guys
text
text
one,
like
two,
twice.
just do,
All right, everybody's answered for this one?
What if I wanted to text 12?
All right, so we're going to go on to the next one. There's 5 of them, and I'll go over the answers at the end. So, number 2, school segregation was a problem only for African Americans in the South. Text A if you believe it's a myth. Text B if you believe it's a fact.
That's mine.
Sometimes I send messages that people care for.
It said it may.
Dude, I got mine right here. I get it every time I send you a text.
That's just gonna be 100%.
Has everybody answered? Okay. Statement 3, African Americans were united in their support for school desegregation. all African Americans wanted desegregation to take place. That's essentially what it means. So text A if you believe it's a myth, B if it's a fact. Nice one.
Thank you. It's called the
Banana.
Cassie plot.
Oh, nice.
Authorized after census.
Dude, I got that one really Cassie bug.
Dude, I think that's something like George would name their phone. You know, like we have all the like names based on like
I'm gonna go.
They're like,
with
alright guys.
Everybody's
You
entered?
got like banana something.
Okay, affirmative action keeps colleges integrated today. I'm going to explain what affirmative action is. So, in the 60s, affirmative action was put into place. It accounted for the struggle African Americans faced throughout history. So this action basically designated certain applicants, spaces for college admissions for blacks, for minorities. It also just helped create a level playing field. So that was just what its purpose was, to create equality. Yes. Thea?
Oh, sorry. Well, they do that for like kind of too, but it's not like there's not like an action against it, but like colleges like to have a
Equal.
balance of
Yeah. So it's just to have more diversity, and diversity would include your race as well as your sex. Okay? And lastly, Brown versus Board of Education ended school segregation. Text A if it's a myth, text B if it's a fact.
Stretching.
Okay. So at this point, you can text end or stop to this message, whatever it told you to do to get out of it.
Oh, you just say
Leave, okay.
leave. Not peeve. Just straight.
And so, just so everybody knows, all the statements that were just covered were myths. And we're going to figure out why they were myths. Alright, so I'm going to give out an article from the Washington Post. It explains why these statements were myths. I'm going to give one paper to each table, designate who's going to speak on your table's behalf.
Right.
Okay, we analyze that.
Yeah, you guys do all the work.
Who wants to speak?
It's
Alright, so Marcel's group, you will be responsible for 1. Robin's group, 2. Parmis, 3. Carson, 4. And Sophie, 5. Alright, so we're going to go through and address why these are myths. So number 1, Brown versus Board of Education was only about school segregation. Marcel's group, can you read the first paragraph only?
Oh, I got it. The first, like, just which
First
one?
paragraph.
The one that starts with like,
It's true.
Oh, okay.
Alright, everybody listen up.
It's true that the case concerned segregation in public schools, but its impact went far beyond education. Brown overturned the 1896 Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, which declared that segregated train cars did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. While it wasn't immediately clear, Brown would eventually dismantle segregation in all public facilities such as train cars, restaurants, department stores, and more. The case emboldened civil rights protesters who, for the first time in nearly 100 years of struggle and defeat, found the federal courts on their side.
Thank you. Robin's group, number 2, Brown versus Board ended school segregation. Can read the first paragraph. First paragraph.
American schools are as segregated today as they were 40 years ago, largely because of residential segregation and the racial gap developed in employment.
Can you speak up? Let's start from the beginning. I hear you. Everybody can hear you. Presidential voice, let's go.
American schools
Nice.
are as segregated today as they were 40 years ago,
still schools that are predominantly white, predominantly black. New York State and Washington, D.C. are still the most racially segregated. Jack's group, can you address number 3? School segregation was a problem only for African Americans in the South. The first paragraph.
Just the first paragraph.
Yeah, loud voice.
Although the starkest Jim Crow laws were found in the Deep South, school segregation was practiced all across the U.S. Oliver and Darlene Brown, the lead plaintiffs in Brown v. Board, brought their case in Topeka, Kansas. 2 of the other cases joined in the Brown litigation were in Delaware and in the district. And the first state court brought about racial segregation in schools was in Massachusetts, Sarah C. Roberts versus the City of Boston, 1849. That ruling declared that it was legal for Boston not to admit 5-year-old Sarah Roberts, who was African American, to her all-white neighborhood school. Although Boston officially stopped having separate schools shortly before the Civil War, in the 1970s, it was the site of one of the most vicious and violent desegregation battles.
Thank you. So this just shows that, there's an overall misconception that that there was only segregation and hostility towards blacks attending schools in the South. But Boston is in Massachusetts, it's in Northeast, the North. And so that just goes to show that even though most people believe the South had the biggest problem with race, there was still an issue in the North. Okay, number 4. African Americans were united in their support for schools desegregation. Rafai's group, can you read that?
African Americans generally rejoiced over the Brown ruling and the other changes it spurred. However, a number of African American critics didn't want school integration to be a priority in the struggle for racial justice. For instance, Zora Neale Hurston argued that fighting for integration suggested that African American schools, notwithstanding that their dedicated and trained faculty members and the role as centers of African American life were inferior. How much satisfaction can I get from a court order for somebody associated with me who does not wish me near them? He wrote in 19.
W.E.B. Du Bois also had reservations. Now, he was the first African American to receive a PhD. He was an educator, a sociologist. In a 1935 article, he argued that a separate Negro school where children are treated like human beings, trained by teachers of their own race, who know what it means to be black, is infinitely better than making our boys and girls doormats. Many others warned that desegregation would mean the loss of an important black professional class. They were correct. Many black schools administrators and teachers lost their jobs in the process of desegregation, and many communities lost control of their schools. Schools remain segregated, but they are no longer the community pillars they once were. In that sense, African Americans sacrificed their most important social institution outside of the church. And lastly, number 5, affirmative action keeps colleges integrated today. Sophie's group.
Affirmative action was imagined as a strategy to create integrated industries, professions, colleges, and universities. For hundreds of years, people of color have been systematically excluded from institutions and opportunities. In the late 1960s and early 70s, affirmative action started to crack open the door of opportunity. However, since 1977, the Supreme Court has been steadily limiting the policy's scope. At present, only elite private institutions have the resources to create the very narrowly tailored affirmative action policies allowed by the court. The vast majority of public colleges and universities, which have a duty to serve broad cross-section of the population, are hamstrung in their efforts to equalize educational opportunity.
Thank you. So those are just 5 myths about Brown versus Board of Education, but obviously we want to know the facts about the case, so we're going to get into that. So the case started with a little girl, a 3rd grader named Linda Brown. She lived in Topeka, Kansas. She was denied access to her neighborhood school 4 blocks away. She was forced to go to a black school 21 blocks away. And so her father was extremely upset by this. He filed a case, and so this went to the Supreme Court. Now this man, Thurgood Marshall, he was born in 1908. He died in 1993. He was a very instrumental civil rights lawyer, and he gave counsel to the NAACP. He was denied admission at the University of Maryland Law School due to race. He was extremely smart. He graduated at the top of his class, but he was denied because he was a black man. And so he was forced to go to Howard University, which is a historically black college, and so he got his schooling there. Little thing about him, his mom pawned her wedding ring and engagement ring to afford his tuition, as well as he was the grandson of a slave. So he was the first African-American Supreme Court justice, and he was extremely influential with this case of the Brown versus Board of Education. All right, so this case was ruled on May 17, 1954. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and what that was all about, at that time they believed separate facilities was equal. Separate but equal is fine, it was constitutional. That was in 1896. The Brown versus Board of Education ruling ruled that unconstitutional, so it overturned it. And that was 58 years later, okay? So this is now saying that separate but equal is unconstitutional. And so this case really helped desegregate American schools, and it initiated conversations about how to dismantle segregation in the South, as well as everywhere in public facilities. Okay, so this is a picture of, it seems like a mom and her daughter. Sophie, can you read what the newspaper says?
It says high court ban segregation in
Yeah. So when the Brown versus Board of Education ruling took place, an African-American newspaper called the Chicago Defender said that this action was considered the second Emancipation Proclamation. So at this time, I want you to turn to a partner and talk about why they may have made that comparison. So first you have to figure out what the Emancipation Proclamation was, who ruled it, who signed it, and talk about how that might relate to this picture. All right, so take about 15 seconds, talk to a neighbor.
So like basically,
Because when America did that to Britain, the first one freed all slaves. Free, but they weren't really free. They ran like this made them free when they weren't. Like, they were free, but they weren't really free. They were separate. They were freely separate.
they were like, it's like saying, hey, you're a tiger, you're free, but you're also in the zoo, so you can't.
Yeah, exactly. That's like
Do I have everybody?
that's like saying that a tiger in the zoo and a tiger in Africa are equal. Like, one's in captivity. Okay. Thanks. What am I reading?
Shush, girl. Shut your lips.
All right, so what did you guys come up with? Why might this comparison have been made?
Hey, oh, we gotta go.
Okay, Theo, go.
Alright, so basically they were like free, but they were like freed as a people. Like, it's basically saying, like, yeah, I came up with a pretty good comparison. It's basically like saying like a tiger that's in a zoo and like in captivity is free because they let him out of his cage to prowl, but like it's not free compared to like a tiger.
Very good analogy. All right.
There's no tigers in Africa, but there are some amazing tigers.
Well, I'm sure there's a zoo in
All right.
Africa that has a tiger.
But, okay, what did the Emancipation Proclamation do?
It freed slaves.
And who did it? Who signed it? Good. Yeah, so you're saying that it brought more equality.
It
And
made
it,
them an action.
yes, and it integrated the schools. Any other thoughts? How might this relate to the picture? Yes.
So, well, we talked about how she told me that the Emancipation Proclamation was when they were free slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, that essentially gave, or was supposed to,
So it's an effort to create more equality in the United States. It's a second freedom for African Americans. So even after 62 years have passed, there's still a divide in schools today, like we talked about earlier. There are still issues with equality across the country in terms of the quality of education you're receiving. So your zip code does hold a lot of weight. Here in State College, I believe you're receiving a great education, but maybe somewhere else, maybe in a city school, they may not have the same resources as you guys, and so their education may be different. Yes?
Doesn't that kind of come with, like, it's more of like the town itself in taxes, so although we may have a better schooling, we have like probably twice the taxes of, so you get it, so it's kind of like
Yeah, property
paying
taxes
for it, it's not like it's just
affect
like,
your school.
yeah, out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm. But then there's still conditions that create these towns to be different in some type of way. Yes.
Kind of like it's a little like more diversified because of college.
Yeah, Penn State does bring in a whole.
Like influences our culture as a town.
Yeah.
Also, like, some colleges are really, like, safe town, like, all, like, crime happens and stuff, but, like, compared to, like, Philly,
No,
it's just,
yeah.
like, completely
Yeah.
different, so, like, that also takes into account.
Yeah.
This
Safety
place is, like,
plays a factor, socioeconomics,
Well,
geography.
Yeah.
That's all creating this divide. So this next chart, or map, shows the 20 most segregated states for black students. This was taken between 2011 and 2012, but what this map is showing you is the percentage of black students in majority white schools. So since we're in Pennsylvania, we'll turn our attention to it. In PA, 28.1% of black students are in majority white schools. Do any of the states surprise you that are up there?
No.
No?
No,
Yeah,
Mississippi.
Florida.
California?
Florida
Florida?
is at 20%.
Atlanta,
Yeah, Mississippi.
Georgia.
Wisconsin.
No, that doesn't surprise me. Ohio doesn't surprise me. Texas don't surprise me. Nevada don't surprise me. But it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, no, that was
Virginia doesn't surprise me.
And this next chart shows the shift in segregation since 1954. So the percentage of black students in majority white schools from 1954 to 2011. So there was segregation during 54, so clearly there was no integration. But you can see as time goes on, is this 88? Yeah, 88, we're at its peak of 43.5% of black students were in majority white schools, and then it tapers down. This ends at 2011, but it's saying that black students are in majority white schools. That's the percentages that it's given. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit, all right? We're going to talk about prom. Tell me when your prom is.
May
I'm
13th.
not going.
May 13th. May 13th.
They'll ruin it.
It's like right after my birthday.
Don't ruin this.
Okay, so when did you say prom is? May 14th. And can everybody go?
No. Juniors. Only if you're a junior, but you can bring people that aren't juniors, but you have to be juniors.
Okay. How much is a ticket to go? Do you guys know?
$10.
You have to pay something?
Always kind of. Nothing's free in this world anymore.
I know, it's a shame. All right, so you have to pay something, right, for a ticket?
20.
Do you guys usually get limos? What's the deal? Tell me about it.
Just walk.
What are your plans? Huh?
We've never been to junior prom.
I think the
Well,
store's
from
selling
past
Batabus
experiences and
tickets.
talking to other people,
I'll rent a really nice car.
rent a car. Okay. But the fact of the matter is everybody can go, right? Everybody can go who wants to go. Correct? Yeah? Okay. All right, so we are going to read two articles. One about a prom in Mississippi and one about a prom in Georgia. And between these two proms, they still have, or at the time they still had segregated proms. In 2009,